November 20th, 1943, 5 miles off Betio Island, Tarawa Atoll. First Lieutenant William Dean Hawkins pressed his binoculars against his eyes, studying the palm-fringed beach through the pre-dawn darkness from the deck of USS Zalin. The 29-year-old Marine Scout sniper from El Paso, Texas, had volunteered to lead the reconnaissance team that would land ahead of the main assault. What he saw through those binoculars made his stomach tighten. The intelligence briefings had promised that naval bombardment would destroy the Japanese defenses, but Hawkins could see concrete bunkers intact, reinforced pillboxes untouched, gun positions that looked fully operational. He lowered the binoculars and turned to his team of scout snipers, 40 men hand-picked for their marksmanship and steady nerves. They sat quietly, checking weapons for the third time, tightening straps on equipment, writing mental letters to people they might never see again. Most were teenagers, farm boys, and city kids who had enlisted after Pearl Harbor, trained for 12 weeks, and were now about to assault a fortified island they'd never heard of 6 months ago. Hawkins knew the statistics. Marine intelligence estimated Japanese strength at 2,500 troops on an island less than 3 miles long. What intelligence hadn't mentioned was that those troops had spent a year transforming Betio into the most heavily fortified piece of real estate in the Pacific. Beneath Hawkins' feet, the Higgins boats were being loaded. These shallow draft landing craft, designed by New Orleans boat builder Andrew Higgins, were supposed to revolutionize amphibious warfare. They could carry 36 combat-loaded Marines, run right up onto a beach, drop their front ramp, and disgorge troops directly into combat. The theory was elegant. The reality, as Hawkins would discover in less than 3 hours, was that theory didn't account for coral reefs, neap tides, and Japanese machine gunners with perfect fields of fire. The plan for Tarawa was simple in concept. The 2nd Marine Division would assault Betio Island, capture the airfield the Japanese had built there, and establish a base for future operations. Naval gunfire and carrier aircraft would soften defenses for hours before the landing. Then 3 waves of Marines in Amtrak's amphibious tractors that could crawl over the reef would establish the beachhead. Following waves in Higgins boats would reinforce success. The whole operation was expected to take 3 days maximum. What the planners hadn't considered was that the Japanese weren't planning to defend at the beach. They were planning to destroy the Americans in the water. Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki commanded the Tarawa garrison. The 53-year-old naval officer had studied American amphibious doctrine and concluded that the Americans' greatest vulnerability came in the transition from sea to land. Let them come, he had decided. Let them commit to the assault. Then destroy them in the water, where they couldn't maneuver, couldn't take cover, couldn't retreat. He had positioned his defenses accordingly. Machine gun nests with interlocking fields of fire covering every yard of beach. Artillery pre-registered on the reef where landing craft would have to stop. Snipers positioned to pick off leaders. The Americans would learn, Shibasaki believed, that fortified islands couldn't be taken by frontal assault. At 0445 hours, the naval bombardment began. Battleships Maryland, Colorado, and Tennessee opened fire from 14,000 yards, their 14-inch guns hurling 1-ton shells into the tiny island. The sound was beyond description, a physical force that seemed to shake the ocean itself. Hawkins watched the island disappear behind clouds of smoke and coral dust. Surely nothing could survive that. The bombardment continued for 2.5 hours. 3,000 tons of high explosive systematically working over every square yard of Betio. Then carrier aircraft arrived, dauntless dive bombers and Avenger torpedo bombers, adding their ordnance to the destruction. At 0830 hours, the bombardment lifted. The first wave of Amtraks churned toward shore, their tracks chewing through the water, Marines hunched in the well decks with rifles and machine guns. Hawkins and his scout snipers were in the 3rd Amtrak of the first wave. As they approached the reef, Japanese artillery opened fire. The shells came with no warning, water spouts erupting around the Amtraks, shrapnel singing through the air. The Amtrak to Hawkins' left took a direct hit and simply disintegrated. 36 Marines gone in an instant. The Amtraks that survived the artillery reached the beach and dropped their ramps. Hawkins was first out, sprinting across coral sand toward the seawall, a coconut log barrier about 4 feet high that the Japanese had built as an obstacle. He made it. Behind him his scouts followed, but machine gun fire was already cutting them down. The naval bombardment hadn't destroyed the defenses. It hadn't even scratched them. The Japanese had built their bunkers with steel-reinforced concrete, buried them under coral and sand, created killing zones that interlocked perfectly. And now they opened fire with every weapon they had. The 4th, 5th, and 6th waves were supposed to come in Higgins' boats, but the tide was wrong. Intelligence had predicted 5 feet of water over the reef. Instead, there were barely 3 feet, not enough for the Higgins boats to float over. They grounded on the reef, 500 yards from shore. The Marines had 2 choices: stay in the boats and get shot, or get out and wade through chest-deep water under fire. They chose to wade. What followed was slaughter. Men weighted down with 60 pounds of equipment struggled through water while Japanese machine gunners shot them methodically. Bodies floated in the lagoon. The water turned red. Marines who made it to the beach found themselves pinned at the seawall, unable to advance, taking casualties from snipers, mortars, and point-blank artillery fire. By noon on the first day, the situation was desperate. Of the 5,000 Marines who had attempted to land, over 1,500 were casualties. The beachhead was less than 100 yards deep. Ammunition was running low. Water was non-existent, all supplies still on ships offshore. Communications had broken down, commanders couldn't locate their units, units couldn't locate each other. The battalion commanders were dead or wounded. Company commanders were dead. Platoon leaders were dead. The chain of command had collapsed to sergeants and corporals, making life or death decisions based on nothing more than their training and instinct. Hawkins, now commanding what remained of his scout sniper unit, plus whatever Marines he'd collected from shattered units, realized that the only way forward was to destroy the Japanese positions one by one. He led a series of attacks against concrete bunkers, using flamethrowers and demolition charges to clear them. He would approach a bunker, sometimes crawling, sometimes sprinting, draw fire to expose the firing ports, then direct flamethrower operators to spray burning fuel into the position. It was close-quarters brutality, fighting measured in yards and minutes, where mistakes meant instant death. On the second day, Hawkins led an assault on a Japanese strongpoint that had stopped all American advance. The position consisted of 3 connected bunkers supporting each other, impossible to flank, impossible to bypass. Hawkins studied it for 15 minutes, then told his Marines what he intended to do. He would charge the center bunker alone, drawing fire while teams moved against the flanking positions. His Marines tried to talk him out of it. Hawkins smiled, checked his weapon, and went. He made it 20 yards before Japanese fire hit him multiple times. He went down hard but kept crawling, kept firing, kept drawing enemy attention while his teams destroyed the flanking bunkers. By the time they reached him, he was unconscious from blood loss. He died that evening, never knowing that his action had broken the Japanese defense line. Tarawa was declared secured on November 23rd, 76 hours after the first Marines hit the beach. The cost was staggering: over 1,000 Americans killed, more than 2,000 wounded, all for an island 3 miles long and 800 yards wide. The Japanese garrison of 4,800 men had been virtually annihilated. Only 17 wounded prisoners were taken. The fighting had been so intense that parts of the island had no living vegetation left, just shattered coral, destroyed bunkers, and bodies. War correspondents who came ashore after the battle were shocked by what they saw. One described the beach as a monument to American courage and Japanese fanaticism. But the lessons learned at Tarawa would save thousands of lives in future operations. The Marines learned that pre-invasion bombardment needed to be longer and more focused. They learned that amphibious assaults required detailed reconnaissance of tides, reefs, and beach conditions. They learned that communication was critical and that backup systems were essential. They learned that flame weapons and demolition charges were more effective than small arms against fortified positions. And they learned that seizing islands from a determined enemy required a willingness to accept casualties that shocked Americans accustomed to the efficient wars of newsreels and propaganda. February the 19th, 1945, 7 miles off the southeastern coast of Iwo Jima, Corporal Tony Stein stood in the well deck of his Higgins boat, checking his weapon for the dozenth time. The weapon wasn't standard Marine Corps issue. Stein, a 23-year-old from Dayton, Ohio, had fabricated it himself in a machine shop on Guadalcanal. He'd taken a .30 caliber machine gun from a wrecked Navy dive bomber, added a custom stock and bipod, and created a weapon that could fire 600 rounds per minute while being carried and operated by one man. His platoon mates called it the Stinger. Stein called it his ticket home. Iwo Jima was different from Tarawa. Everyone knew it would be different. The island was larger, 8 square miles of volcanic rock and black sand. The Japanese garrison was larger, over 21,000 men commanded by Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, one of the most capable officers in the Imperial Japanese Army, and the strategic importance was greater. Iwo Jima sat directly between the B-29 bases in the Marianas and Japan. Capturing it would provide an emergency landing field for damaged bombers and a base for fighter escorts. The island had to be taken, regardless of cost. Kuribayashi had studied American tactics and concluded that trying to stop them at the beach was futile.
Instead, he had spent months transforming Iwo Jima into a fortress.
His men had dug 11 miles of tunnels, connecting bunkers, artillery positions, and command posts into an underground network. They had positioned artillery on Mount Suribachi, the volcanic cone at the island's southern tip, with perfect observation over the landing beaches. They had created thousands of hidden firing positions, camouflaged so well that Marines would pass within feet without seeing them. And Kuribayashi had ordered his men not to waste themselves in banzai charges. Fight from cover, inflict maximum casualties, make the Americans pay in blood for every yard. The pre-landing bombardment of Iwo Jima was the heaviest in Pacific War history. For 3 days, Navy ships poured shells into the island. Carrier aircraft struck anything that moved. B-24 Liberators flew from the Marianas to drop additional ordnance. The island was obscured by smoke and dust. Surely, the Marines thought, nothing could survive this. But Kuribayashi's defenses had been built to survive exactly this. His bunkers were buried under volcanic rock, impervious to anything short of direct hits from the largest shells. His artillery was in caves with retractable doors. His men waited underground, safe from the bombardment, ready to emerge when the Americans landed. The first wave hit the beach at 0900 hours. Stein's boat was in the 5th wave, scheduled to land 15 minutes after the first. As his Higgins boat approached shore, he could see Marines on the beach. But something was wrong. They weren't advancing. They were stuck, struggling through volcanic sand that swallowed boots and made movement exhausting. The beach sloped sharply upward in terraces, each one requiring Marines to climb while burdened with equipment. And as the Americans struggled with the terrain, Japanese artillery opened fire. Stein's boat hit the beach and dropped its ramp. He charged out, immediately sinking ankle-deep in black sand that had the consistency of loose gravel. The sound of incoming artillery was constant, shells exploding randomly across the beach, each one sending up geysers of sand and shrapnel. Stein saw Marines from earlier waves pinned down at the first terrace, unable to advance. He ran forward, the Stinger heavy in his arms, found cover behind a destroyed Amtrak, and started looking for targets. Japanese positions were almost impossible to spot. A puff of smoke from a cave mouth, a muzzle flash from a camouflaged bunker, movement in the rocks on Suribachi. Stein would see the hint of a target, aim his stinger, and fire short bursts, the weapon bucking in his arms. Then he'd move, never staying in one place longer than necessary. He learned quickly that the Japanese were targeting anyone who looked like a leader or anyone with a distinctive weapon. His stinger made him a target. He didn't care. His job was to suppress enemy fire so other Marines could advance. By late afternoon on the first day, Stein had made 8 separate trips back to the beach to get more ammunition for his stinger. Each trip meant crossing 400 yards of open ground under fire. On his 5th trip, he stopped to help carry a wounded Marine to the beach. On his 7th trip, he covered a demolition team trying to destroy a particularly troublesome bunker. By evening, his platoon commander estimated Stein had fired over 10,000 rounds and had personally suppressed at least 20 Japanese positions. The battle for Iwo Jima would last 36 days, the longest and bloodiest battle in Marine Corps history. Of the 70,000 Marines who landed, nearly 7,000 were killed and 19,000 wounded. The Japanese garrison was virtually annihilated, with only 216 captured alive. Kuribayashi's defense-in-depth strategy had worked exactly as planned. Every yard cost American lives. Every bunker had to be cleared with flamethrowers and demolition charges. Every cave had to be sealed with Marines inside, fighting in darkness against enemies they couldn't see. Tony Stein survived the first day but was killed on March 1st, leading another attack against Japanese positions. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the first of 27 Medals of Honor awarded for Iwo Jima, more than any other single battle in American history. His stinger is preserved at the Marine Corps Museum in Quantico, a reminder that American success in the Pacific often came down to individual Marines improvising solutions to impossible problems. The island-hopping campaign that took Americans from Guadalcanal in 1942 to Okinawa in 1945 was a series of such improvisations. Each island presented unique challenges. Each battle required adapting tactics to conditions that couldn't be predicted. The Marines who fought these battles weren't professional soldiers in the European sense. Most were citizen soldiers. Civilians who had enlisted after Pearl Harbor received rushed training and were thrown into combat situations more intense than anything experienced by their fathers in World War I, July 21st, 1944. 400 yards inland from Blue Beach, Guam, Private First Class, Frank Witek crouched behind a fallen tree, listening to the sounds of fighting ahead. The 20-year-old from Darby, Connecticut, had landed with the 3rd Marine Division 18 hours earlier. The invasion of Guam was supposed to liberate American territory, the only U.S. soil occupied by Japan. The 19,000 Japanese defenders had other ideas. They had spent 2 years fortifying the island, and they were making the Americans pay for every yard. Witek's squad had been pinned down for 3 hours by a Japanese machine gun position that commanded the entire draw they were trying to cross. 2 Marines had already been hit trying to flank the position. The squad leader was dead, killed by a sniper. The assistant squad leader was wounded. That made Witek, as senior fire team leader, responsible for the 12 remaining Marines of his squad. He studied the terrain, trying to find an approach that wouldn't get them all killed. The Japanese machine gun was positioned in a coral outcropping, perfect cover with excellent fields of fire. Frontal assault was suicide. Flanking seemed impossible. Both sides of the draw were covered by the machine gun. Witek realized there was only one option. Someone had to charge the position head-on, drawing fire and getting close enough to destroy it with grenades. It was a one-way mission. Whoever went wasn't coming back. Witek looked at his squad, mostly 19- and 20-year-olds, boys really. He made his decision. Before anyone could stop him, Witek was running. Not toward the machine gun, but at an angle, zigzagging through the coral and brush, deliberately drawing fire. The Japanese gunner swung his weapon to track this lone Marine. Wojtek went down, hit in the leg, but kept crawling, kept moving, kept drawing attention. His squad used the distraction to move forward. Wojtek got close enough to throw his grenades. The first fell short. The second destroyed the machine gun position. Japanese infantry counterattacked immediately. Wojtek, bleeding and unable to walk, used his rifle to kill 4 Japanese soldiers before he was overrun and killed. The battle for Guam lasted 3 weeks. 21 days of continuous combat in oppressive heat, through jungles where visibility was measured in feet, across coral cliffs where every foothold had to be fought for. The 3rd Marine Division suffered over 1,400 killed and 5,700 wounded. The Japanese garrison of 19,000 was virtually annihilated. Guam was liberated, but the cost made Americans wonder if every Pacific island would require such sacrifice. The strategic logic of the island-hopping campaign was clear in Washington and Pearl Harbor. Each island captured provided airfields closer to Japan. Each airfield meant shorter missions for bombers, longer loiter time for fighters, better support for future invasions. The path to Tokyo led through islands most Americans had never heard of: Tarawa, Kwajalein, Saipan, Tinian, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. But for the Marines and soldiers who fought on those islands, strategy was meaningless. Their world contracted to immediate threats: the machine gun in that bunker, the sniper in that tree, the mortar position behind that ridge. September 15, 1944. Orange Beach, Peleliu Island. Colonel Louis Chesty Puller watched his 1st Marine Regiment hit the beach and immediately walk into hell. The 56-year-old Virginian was the most decorated Marine in the Corps, a legend who had fought in Haiti, Nicaragua, Guadalcanal, and Cape Gloucester. He had seen combat in 4 wars over 25 years. What he was witnessing at Peleliu shocked even him. The pre-invasion intelligence for Peleliu had been catastrophically wrong. Analysts had estimated Japanese strength at 10,000 troops and had predicted the island would be secured in 4 days. The reality was that Colonel Kunio Nakagawa commanded over 11,000 men who had spent months preparing defenses that made Tarawa look primitive. Nakagawa had taken Kuribayashi's concepts and perfected them. No beach defense, no banzai charges, instead a defense in depth that would bleed the Americans dry. The Marines landing on Peleliu's beaches found themselves in a killing zone more sophisticated than anything they'd encountered. Japanese artillery firing from caves on the ridges, overlooking the beaches, had the entire landing area pre-registered. As soon as the first Amtraks hit shore, artillery fire began, precise and devastating. Puller watched his regiment take casualties before they even got off the beach. Machine guns hidden in coral outcropping began firing. Mortars, invisible in the ridges, dropped rounds with mechanical precision. Within 30 minutes, his regiment had taken over 200 casualties. Puller's objective was the airfield, 800 yards inland. To reach it, his Marines had to cross an open area the Japanese had turned into a free fire zone. Every yard was covered by interlocking fields of fire. Every piece of cover concealed a Japanese position. Puller, radioing from the beach command post, urged his battalion commanders forward. The Marines tried. They died in windrows, cut down by fire from positions they couldn't see. By nightfall, on the first day, the 1st Marine Regiment had suffered over 1,000 casualties, nearly 1/3 of its strength. The airfield hadn't been reached. The beachhead was barely 300 yards deep. Japanese counterattacks throughout the night inflicted additional casualties. By the 3rd day, Puller's regiment was combat ineffective, so depleted that it had to be withdrawn from the line and essentially rebuilt. The battle for Peleliu, predicted to last 4 days, would continue for over 2 months. The Umabrogol Mountains, a series of coral ridges honeycombed with caves, became the site of some of the most intense fighting in the Pacific. The Japanese had transformed the ridges into a fortress with artillery positions, command bunkers, and fighting positions all connected by tunnels. American attacks would seize one position only to be hit by fire from another they hadn't seen. Flame tanks, essential for cave warfare, broke down in the coral. Artillery was ineffective against targets deep in caves. The only solution was for infantry to go in cave by cave using flamethrowers, demolition charges, and close-quarters combat. Private First Class Arthur Jackson, a 19-year-old from Cleveland, Ohio, spent 12 days fighting in the Umabragol Ridges with K Company, 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines. Years later, he would describe it as combat that reduced men to something primal. The heat was unbearable, often reaching 115 degrees. Water was scarce. Food consisted of K rations eaten cold because heating anything drew sniper fire. Men fought in the same filthy utilities for weeks. Coral dust got into everything: weapons, food, eyes. The smell of death was constant, as bodies couldn't be recovered from no man's land between the ridges. On September 18th, Jackson's platoon was tasked with clearing a cave system that had stopped all progress in their sector. The cave entrance was on a sheer coral cliff, reachable only by climbing exposed to enemy fire. Jackson volunteered to go first. He climbed the cliff carrying a flamethrower, took fire from multiple positions, reached the cave entrance, and sprayed burning fuel inside. Japanese soldiers, ablaze, ran from the cave. Jackson's squad shot them. Then Jackson entered the cave, which proved to be a tunnel complex extending deep into the ridge. He went through it alone, using his flamethrower to clear each chamber, killing dozens of Japanese soldiers in the darkness. The Battle for Peleliu officially ended on November 27, 1944, 73 days after the invasion. Of the 28,000 Marines and soldiers who fought there, over 9,000 were casualties. The Japanese garrison of 11,000 was virtually annihilated, with fewer than 200 captured. The strategic value of Peleliu, an island that was supposed to be needed for the Philippines' invasion, proved negligible. The Philippines campaign succeeded without it. Peleliu became, in historian Bill Ross's words, a battle that didn't need to be fought, though no one told that to the Marines who died there. The human cost of the island-hopping campaign was staggering. From Guadalcanal in 1942 to Okinawa in 1945, over 100,000 Americans were killed or wounded capturing islands that, in total, contained less land area than Connecticut. Each battle followed a similar pattern: heavy naval bombardment that looked devastating but often did little damage to well-prepared defenses.
An amphibious assault that faced withering fire from concealed positions.
Days or weeks of close-quarters combat to clear the enemy from caves and bunkers. And finally, the grim task of sealing caves with Japanese soldiers inside who refused to surrender. The tactics evolved as the campaign progressed. At Tarawa, Marines had landed in daylight, giving Japanese gunners perfect visibility. By Iwo Jima, pre-dawn landings became standard. At Tarawa, naval gunfire had been short and poorly coordinated. By Okinawa, bombardment lasted for days and was precisely targeted based on detailed reconnaissance. At Tarawa, communication between units broke down immediately. By the Philippines, redundant radio systems and better training kept commands connected even under intense fire. Technology improved too. The flamethrower, a weapon that most Marines initially viewed with horror, became recognized as essential for cave warfare. Flame tanks mounting flamethrowers on Sherman tank chassis could project burning fuel over 100 yards, clearing bunkers that were impervious to gunfire. Demolition charges became standardized, with Marines learning precisely how much explosive was needed to collapse a cave entrance or destroy a bunker. Amphibious vehicles improved, with later models capable of carrying more men faster and with better protection. But no technology, no tactic, no amount of training could eliminate the fundamental reality of Pacific Island warfare. Taking fortified positions from a determined enemy required infantry to close with and destroy the enemy in his positions. That meant Marines and soldiers had to walk into fire, climb coral cliffs under machine gun fire, enter caves not knowing what waited inside, and continue fighting even when wounded, exhausted, and terrified. The medals awarded for Pacific battles tell the story. 27 Medals of Honor at Iwo Jima, 14 at Peleliu, 13 at Okinawa. The medals were awarded for actions that involved charging machine guns, clearing bunkers alone, sacrificing oneself to save others. They were acts of courage that went beyond training or duty into something that defies explanation. April 1st, 1945, Hagushi Beach, Okinawa. Private First Class Desmond Doss waded ashore with the 77th Infantry Division, carrying no weapon. The 26-year-old from Virginia was a combat medic and a conscientious objector who refused to carry a rifle on religious grounds. His unit had initially rejected him, viewing his pacifism as cowardice. By the time the battle for Okinawa ended 82 days later, Doss would be recognized as one of the most courageous men in the American military. The invasion of Okinawa was the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific, with over 180,000 troops landing in the first wave. The island, just 350 miles from mainland Japan, was the final stepping stone before the invasion of Japan itself. The Japanese understood this. They had assembled over 100,000 troops on Okinawa, supported by thousands of Okinawan conscripts. Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, commanding the defense, had learned the lessons of every previous island battle. He wouldn't contest the beaches. He would let the Americans land, let them move inland, and then destroy them in prepared positions where American firepower advantages were minimized. The first day was eerily quiet. Americans landed expecting fierce resistance and found none. They moved inland against light opposition. Some units advanced several miles on the first day, far exceeding objectives. Optimists talked about securing the island in weeks. Then the Americans reached the Shuri Line, a defensive complex centered on Shuri Castle in southern Okinawa, and the real battle began. Ushijima had positioned his defenses on ridges with interlocking fields of fire in a landscape where every hill was fortified and every valley was a killing zone. The Americans attacked with infantry, tanks, artillery, naval gunfire, and close air support. They made painfully slow progress, measured in yards per day, at costs that shocked commanders. Casualties were so heavy that replacement troops were thrown into combat with minimal training. Units that landed at full strength were combat ineffective within weeks. May 5, 1945, Maeda Escarpment, Okinawa. Doss's unit was assigned to assault a 400-foot coral escarpment that the Americans called Hacksaw Ridge. The Japanese had fortified the top of the escarpment with bunkers, caves, and artillery positions. Assaulting it meant climbing cargo nets hung down the cliff face while under fire from above. Doss's battalion made it to the top after brutal fighting, but was immediately counterattacked. The fighting was hand-to-hand in some places, Americans and Japanese battling with rifles, bayonets, and fists. The battalion was ordered to withdraw at nightfall. Doss realized that over 70 wounded men were still on top of the escarpment, unable to move. Evacuating them down the cliff would be impossible under fire. Doss refused to leave them. As his unit withdrew, he stayed behind alone, moving through the battlefield, finding wounded men, dragging them to the cliff edge, and lowering them down using a rope sling he improvised from ammunition belts. He worked all night under sporadic fire, moving between American and Japanese positions in total darkness. By dawn, he had lowered 75 men to safety. The next day, American forces retook the top of the escarpment. Doss continued his work, treating wounded under fire, repeatedly exposing himself to enemy fire to reach injured men. He was wounded multiple times, but refused evacuation until all other wounded had been evacuated. He would be awarded the Medal of Honor, the first conscientious objector to receive the decoration. His citation noted that he had saved over 75 lives through actions that demonstrated courage, beyond anything expected of combat soldiers. The battle for Okinawa lasted until June 22, 1945. American casualties exceeded 50,000 killed and wounded, the highest single battle toll of the Pacific War. Japanese military losses approached 110,000 killed. Okinawan civilian casualties, caught between two armies fighting to annihilation, exceeded 100,000. The island had become a charnel house, every village destroyed, every field cratered by artillery, every cave filled with bodies. The strategic lessons from Okinawa were clear and terrifying for American planners. If a mid-sized island 350 miles from Japan cost 50,000 American casualties, what would invading Japan itself cost? Estimates ranged from 500,000 to over 1 million American casualties. Japanese casualties would be in the millions. The decision to use atomic weapons was made in large part because the alternative, invading a Japan defended by millions of soldiers and civilians prepared to fight to the death, seemed unbearable after seeing what happened at Tarawa, Iwo Jima, Peleliu, and Okinawa. The Marines and soldiers who fought the island-hopping campaign returned home as different men than those who had enlisted after Pearl Harbor. They had seen combat at intensities that most humans never experience. They had watched friends die, had killed at close range, had endured conditions of heat, filth, and fear that broke many. The psychological toll wouldn't be called PTSD for decades, but it was present in every veteran who woke screaming from nightmares, who couldn't tolerate loud noises, who struggled to readjust to civilian life where people complained about rationing and inconvenience. The official histories remember the battles and the medals. They record the dates, the units involved, the casualties taken. What they often miss are the small moments that defined the campaign for those who fought it. The Marine who shared his last canteen of water with a wounded Japanese soldier. The Navy corpsman who worked 72 hours straight treating wounded without sleep. The demolition team that spent a week clearing a single ridge, destroying 300 caves one by one. The pilots who flew close air support missions so close to friendly lines that they could see individual Marines on the ground. These moments, undocumented and unrecognized, were what the island-hopping campaign actually was for the men who fought it. The forgotten battlefields of the Pacific, the islands with names that most Americans have never heard and couldn't locate on a map, were where American victory was actually won. Not in the dramatic carrier battles that made headlines, not in the strategic decisions made in Washington, but on coral atolls and volcanic islands where Marines and soldiers fought the most brutal close-quarters combat in American military history. They fought not for glory or territory, but because it was their job, because their buddies beside them were depending on them, because going forward into enemy fire seemed marginally better than living with the knowledge that you hadn't. When the war ended in August 1945, the men who had island-hopped across the Pacific came home to parades and celebrations. They were heroes, and they deserved recognition. But most of them didn't feel like heroes. They felt like survivors of something that shouldn't have happened, that couldn't be explained to people who hadn't been there. They remembered the islands not as victories, but as places where friends died, where they had done things they never wanted to remember, where they had learned that human beings are capable of both extraordinary courage and extraordinary brutality. The legacy of the Pacific Island hopping campaign lives on in the Marine Corps' institutional memory, in the tactics and training that emphasize initiative, improvisation, and perseverance in the face of impossible odds. It lives on in the monuments at Tarawa, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, places where Americans died so far from home that most families never visited the graves. And it lives on in the few remaining veterans, men now in their 90s, who can still recall the smell of cordite and coral dust, the sound of machine gun fire, the faces of friends who never came home from islands whose names they'll never forget.